From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Before everybody falls asleep, and once they hear the title of today's episode, we want to assure you that this is not going to be full of a bunch of dry, academic, unsexy language. We're talking about something important. We're talking about something that is often misreported. And we're talking about something that, can be a little misleading on the offset. So we thought, or at least I thought, a good way to get into this would be with a thought experiment. So imagine if one day, yours truly, me, your old pal Ben, and Josh Clark, friend of the show from Stuff You Should Know, imagine we are yet again beefing over some weird trivia point that no one except for people like our crews would care about. Maybe it's domestication or some arcane little thing from a brain stuff video, and tensions are rising.
Well, first of all, Ben, if it results in an academic rumble, I hope you know that Matt and I had your back to the end.
Mm-hmm. Because I've called you off channel and I've said, hey, things are getting, that crazy dictator Josh Clark is going wild. This injustice will not stand. And you say, well, we've seen the public statements Josh and Ben are making. They're talking about how the other guy's a jerk and a pill, but we think nobody actually really wants an open conflict. A disagreement's okay. A rumble is maybe a bridge too far. So instead of coming into the office and attempting to physically smack me around, let's say Josh calls in some favors and suddenly no one in Atlanta will sell me a quesadilla. In fact, no one will even is allowed to sell me the ingredients to make a quesadilla. He hasn't launched a missile at me. He hasn't physically harmed me or any of the folks I roll with, but he's hit me where it hurts. He's affected my quality of life. This is a hopefully silly version of a very serious and dangerous thing, a concept called a sanction. So we have to hear the facts here. And yes, here are the facts. But this whole thing is kind of crazy, right? We've talked about it before. You see the public statements of various politicians or dictators or presidents, and what they talk about in an international sphere is way different from what they talk about with their domestic sphere when they want support. But one of the big secrets is most stable nations actually do not want continual large-scale hot wars. People don't want a World War III, or they definitely don't want to be seen as the kid on the playground who throws the first rock. You know what I mean? That's why it's always like, we're defending ourselves. We sent all these drones and thousands of troops to this country. Most Americans can't find on a map because we're defending ourselves. Oh, or we're fighting for human rights, whatever the thing is. Everybody wants to be seen as the good guy. No one wants to be thought of as the bad guy.
Well, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter.
In my mind, that's why a well-executed false flag is so handy.
Mm-hmm. Gulf of Tonkin. Yes. You know what?
For the win.
Right. It's kind of a shame that, well, it's not a shame. The world's a better place because of this, but what kind of world would it be if we could do our own false flags? People have tried that before. What was it? Jesse Smollett, most infamously recently. That's the actor who staged an assault, and his false flag was unsuccessful. He did get busted. But nations do want to make sure they can somehow make their aims and their desires known. And ideally, they want as many other nations to agree with them, and they like to posse up. But they also can't really trust each other. That's the thing. Countries are not friends. No matter what the people currently driving those things are saying, the concept of friendship doesn't make sense at this level. You can't really trust people. You can't trust institutions. So if you make a previous agreement, right? If it's something where like Matt and Noel and Mission Control and Doc and Scully and Ben are part of their own, we're part of our own agreement, and we made the great, quesadilla accords, even amongst each other, we have to have a mechanism to enforce that agreement, because otherwise, like this is what you're talking about, I think, Noel, when you say, does something have teeth, right? Like we were talking about this a little off air. Otherwise, it could be one of those non-binding resolutions, and people just ignore those. You're not going to send in troops. They're just going to say, hey, our understanding of that agreement was different. So fiddle-dee-dee. What you going to do, bro?
I mean, who decided to call them that? Non-binding agreements. It's like inherently not that scary. It's like, maybe we'll do it. Maybe we won't. See how we feel on the day.
It makes perfect sense, really. And it's just a public-facing release of a group's opinion on something, right? And it's just the first step. It's always the first step. If sanctions occur, there's almost always some kind of resolution that's put forward that's just like hey, here's how we feel about this. Just, it's a little heads up. There could be something else coming.
Mm-hmm. You have to have consequences. You have to have some kind of if-then equation going on. And ideally, you want to be able to either incentivize countries toward doing something you want them to do, even to the point of like pollution regulations, or you want to de-incentivize them from doing something else, right? So you don't want Libya or North Korea or South Africa to pursue nuclear armament. So you make these deals with them, and historically, I don't want to ruffle too many roost here, but historically, nations know that if they do back down from pursuing nuclear weaponry, things still aren't going to work out very well. I mean, there's a reason Gaddafi doesn't have a podcast now. That's somewhat of a cold way to say it, but it's true. So you don't want war, but you want to get your way. So here's where sanctions come in. There are a couple of broad types, and they're all used to one degree or another. And there's a lot of inequality in the world of sanctions, but they're also conspiratorial, because to be effective, they have to have a group that conspires, not just public entities, by the way, not just governments, but banks play a huge role in this. They get together and they conspire to change the actions of another nation, or in some cases, other groups of nations, or in some cases, even VIP, very high-powered individuals. If you are listening to this podcast, the odds are, and no offense to anyone, the odds are you're probably not a big enough deal to have the UN say, like, Paul, Mission Control has to be stopped. He can no longer control the dog toy market or something like that. We're talking like Putin's at that level. And at that point too, we'll get to this question in a second. You have to ask yourself, given how controversial the U.S. is, given how controversial past presidents and politicians here have been seen, by people abroad, like how controversial their actions are, how come they don't have a bunch of sanctions? We'll tell you, but first we have to talk about the lay of the land. So sanctioning a country, that's what most people have heard about. We're mad that Cuba is communist. Nobody sell them anything. We're not going to sell them anything, but if you hear this, you can't either, just because that's how we want it to be, or Syria.
And
or
in
Iran.
that case, in the case with Cuba, the Soviet Union hears that and goes, "Oh, we'll gladly trade things with you."
Exactly. That's part of the problem here. And then there are list-based sanctions, like we talked about the HSBC drug cartel conspiracy and how that was a controversy because they were knowingly washing dirty money for organized crime. Well, they could have fallen under sanctions for that, because if the EU, the US, or the UN had said, we're issuing a list-based sanction, you cannot do business with known drug cartels or terrorists or, supervillains like Carlos the Jackal or whatever. I just keep saying that name because it's so cool. Those are a real thing. And essentially, like if you look at it now, there's a way to target any group. You can move the lens however you wish. Vast majority of people alive aren't going to get specifically targeted by sanctions. But the scary part is you might be affected by them, even if you do not live in the country that has those sanctions imposed on them. And when we're hearing this thrown around, obviously sanction has a couple of different meanings, right? Like, let's say me and Noel, Matt walks into the office one day and Noel and I are clearly heisting the little cooler where we keep all the fancy sodas and whatnot. And then you say, what is wrong with you guys? You're supposed to be company men. And then we tell you, our actions are sanctioned. The network said it was okay. That's a different kind of sanction, right?
These sodas are for everyone.
We're free. We are liberating these sodas. We got a flag and everything.
Yeah, you often hear like the hyphenate of that, like government sanctioned whatever, terrorism even, right? Like you heard sometimes that term is used as like a ding on the government, where maybe it's not officially sanctioned, but you can call some negative behavior something sanctioned, government sanctioned, to imply that there was approval given, that this was like there was cosant by the highest level of authority.
Yes,
government sanctioned burning of rice paddies.
Yeah,
right.
Or books.
Mm-hmm. And so when you hear this term thrown around, what you're going to hear, what they're referring to really, the full name is like international sanctions. That's the state level stuff. Even though there are a lot of people in the world who wish that they could impose their own sanctions, the best you can do in your life as a private individual is going to be to attempt to create a boycott, right? And get a bunch of other people to agree with you and say, hey, we're not gonna support tours in Miami, Florida because of something Miami did. And if you get enough people to agree with you, then that's kind of like a sanction, but it's way less powerful. I think we should talk about like the different categories of what we're looking at here, because they're not all created equally. Some are more dangerous than others, but they all have some punch. One of them especially is very, I think, topical now, and it's surprisingly effective, but not in a way that says impressive things about humanity.
Well, let's start off with ye old financial sanction or an economic sanction. This is probably the most common one you've heard about, certainly recently over the past 10, 20 years. It's the concept. We are agreeing to not sell this country / this ruler anything, and or very specific things, and or we're not going to buy any goods of a specific type from this country, or you're not allowed to, basically. And then again, like in the case of Iran, there's a sanction that says no one can buy iron or steel from Iran. And then, private companies out of another country like China say, we'll gladly take that steel at a very low price. And if you take it back to the cheese example, the quesadilla example that we set up earlier, it would be, it'd be the concept of not only can no one sell, let's say Ben, quesadillas, no one can even sell him cheese. No one can sell him pork. I don't know, beef. What do you put in your quesadillas, Ben?
Well, at this point, damn near anything I could get my hands on. It's terrible. Life is
too bad. No tortillas. No tortillas for me.
This will not stand. I'm radicalized. No, you're right. And this sounds like a silly example again, but consider it in the realm of nuclear research, because so much nuclear equipment is dual use, meaning the same things that can build peaceful nuclear power plants can be used to build nuclear weapons. So banning a quesadilla purchase is saying nobody can sell intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, to Iran. That would be one example. But going further and saying, you can't buy the ingredients, you can't buy the cheese and the tortillas and the mushrooms, what have you. That's like a 1-to-1 comparison with saying not only can you not buy missiles, but you can't buy the stuff that would be used to assemble missiles. You can't buy the plutonium that could be refined or the uranium that could be refined. You can't buy the centrifuges. And we don't believe anything you're saying about peaceful nuclear power. So that's all that's going to happen. Typically, these sanctions, mainly for humanitarian and PR purposes, they'll have some exemptions. And they'll say, like, okay, you can't trade anything except necessities for ordinary people. So you can buy food or medicine, right, from international producers of those things. Stuff like insulin, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, this is one that can really hurt, you know? We were talking a little bit about this off air, and I was sort of saying how, like, you know, a blockade, you know, for example, of goods and services from one country to another isn't the same as like an invasion. It's not a hot war. It's like us staying on our turf and just saying, nope, you can't come through or you can't get stuff from us. But those things matter if you're like the number one producer of said good, and it results in people maybe getting sick or not getting the things they need for basic survival.
Mm-hmm. And they're enforced, by the way. We should also say this. One of the things that makes them binding is violation of sanctions is considered a crime. And it doesn't matter if everybody agrees to the sanction. The U.S. does a lot of what are called unilateral sanctions, which is just Uncle Sam saying, I don't like him. You shouldn't like him either. And if you are a business that's based in this country, then it's illegal for you to mess with them. Even if that was the entirety of your business before, we will put you under the jail and we'll put you in the poorhouse. We don't care. And they usually, because the global West controls the banking system, or the vast majority of what we call the anatomy of the banking system across the world, they can really, really make an impact there. And these things can be tremendously damaging. Usually before you get to like a big catastrophic economic sanction, you've got a diplomatic sanction. And the best way to explain a diplomatic sanction is, we're mad at you. We're closing down our clubhouse. We're not staying at the slumber party. We're going back to mom's. So that's like, we're closing the embassy. We're not taking your calls. We're not going to meetings with you until you apologize. And because this is stuff they don't want you to know, we're pretty open about this. When we're talking about diplomacy, we're also talking about spies. We're also talking about assets and tradecraft and the intelligence community, because not every IT director or not every IT grunt at your local embassy is necessarily actually an IT guy.
Yeah. Well, and the United States has a specific department that we're going to get into when we talk about the history here within the Department of Treasury, called the OFAC, or the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control. And a major part of their mission is to gather intelligence on countries and individuals who have sanctions placed against them.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. They're the enforcers of this, and you won't hear a ton about them when you hear sanctions mentioned on, say, your CNN or whatever your news channel of choice is. They don't get talked a lot about. They're not super sexy, but they're not super secret. You know, they're just the people who have to enforce the at times grandiose statements and declarations of politicians, whether they are made in good faith or bad faith. There are also military sanctions. Wait, you might be saying, how is a military sanction not a war? You don't have to declare war to have a military sanction. That's a targeted strike, right? That's like a UAV taking out a factory. Factories are a great example of this, attacking manufacturing infrastructure. You will just have country A saying, we know you're up to something at that factory, so we took it off the table. Now you apologize for making us do that to you. That's kind of how it goes. And it should be no surprise that,
ouch.
Yeah, it does. It's tough to figure out. We'll talk about whether that situation would be considered successful later. But so we've got military, diplomatic, economic. Here's the one that surprises me. It's a real thing. Sports sanctions. You have probably heard stories about this where, like, person from insert country here is not allowed to play at the Olympics because their country got in trouble. It has nothing to do with, chess or volleyball or what have you. This is a soft power push. You're not allowing a given country's athletes, teams, or individuals to compete internationally. And it sounds kind of absurd that this would matter, but this one does actually work because people are by and large the same across the planet. They hate it when their favorite sports teams don't get a chance to win something. So, like, if the economic pressure is not pushing a dictator out of a place of power, then not letting the national soccer team compete in the Olympics or, God forbid, the World Cup, that might push the needle. People might say, okay, I was all right with a lot of injustices, but you touched the football, Your Excellency. And that's a line too far. That can actually work. Why does that work?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. It's a hit to pride, I think, and nationalism. If you think back to I guess they were sanctions put on Russia during the Olympics, but it wasn't exactly the kind we're discussing here, but very similar because of the anti-doping movement and some of the mechanisms there, both within the Russian Federation and the Olympics Committee. Where I can't remember fully, you guys, but I remember in the last Summer Olympics, or maybe it was 2 Olympics ago, many Russian athletes were not allowed to compete, and if they were allowed to compete, they weren't allowed to have a medal ceremony if they won. There's something very similar happened with the Winter Olympics. It just happened in the Winter Olympics. Oh man, I'm blanking on it. There was a skater it was decided she was allowed to compete, but if she won a medal, there would be no official ceremony.
Bummer. I mean, that's kind of the thing that every, young Olympian dreams of, is standing on that podium and getting handed that medal.
That skater's name, if you look it up, is Kamila Valieva, Valieva.
It's a soft power thing. Soft power is weird, and it works. Don't let the name soft fool you. It is measurable.
It's an optics thing. It's about humiliation, kind of, in a way.
And it's a war of perception too. Also, a lot of times the proposed ideas for sanctions are not the entire story. Let's be very clear about that. Like if you look at some, especially during the Cold War, if you look at some of these things, what they're proposing and the full extent of their calculus are often not announced together. You have to do digging to figure out what's happening. The new kid on the block here is environmental sanctions. The idea is you can put up trade barriers and restrictions to stop poaching, to stop pollution, and so on. Honestly, the jury is still out on whether this works. But the logic's there. Hitting someone in the wallet has definitely made a difference in the past. You always hear that phrase when people talk about sanctions. It's hitting someone in the wallet. And I can't help but think of I Think You Should Leave Now, where the guy's like, you hit me in the cup. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
You got to give.
Yes.
You got to
give. Yeah. Otherwise, it'll go dark.
Right.
Give.
You know what? I hope if anyone hasn't seen that show or that episode, I hope you think we're just having a weird freestyle conversation.
Just do yourself a favor and check it out. The episodes are 18 minutes or something crazy like that. You will know very quickly whether it's your thing or not, but I hope it is.
You hit me in the cup. Anyway, so those are that's kind of the bare bones, the different flavors in the Baskin Robbins of international sanctions. Sanctions also, they take international cooperation to really be effective. The UN certainly thinks about them a lot. One country alone can lead a sanction initiative, but they're going to have a hard time meeting their own goals. And yes, that includes the big dogs, the Chinas, the Russias, the USs. And that's because in many cases, if one country won't sell you something, like you were pointing out earlier, Matt, somebody else will. The US is a huge fan of unilateral sanctions. They have regrettable personal experience with this conundrum. And that wasn't always the case, because while sanctions sound like a modern day thing, back in the eras of yore, You could totally sanction the crap out of someone on your own. There's a journalist, Uri Friedman, who's writing on foreign policy, and he points this out. He says, quote, as a blunt tool of diplomacy, the concept of sanctions has been around at least from the time of the ancient Greeks, when Athens imposed a trade embargo on its neighbor Megara in 432 BCE. So they are very old. And Noel, like you had mentioned, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, the old school sanctions were physical shutdowns, right? We're building a wall around all your stuff. Now do what we say.
And that was a bit different in 432 BCE, where you could literally just send troops and block off some roads, kind of like what was happening in Ottawa and other places in the world with the trucks. But trucks, you just do it with soldiers, and
like
there's
only
a few trade routes.
Phalanx? How do you pronounce that word? Where they literally line up with shields and create a human wall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could do that. And to your point, Matt, these things were happening before there were global trade and communication networks anywhere near what exists today. So Megara wouldn't have had the option to, and pardon my Greek pronunciation, folks, but it wouldn't have had the option to say, contact some equivalent of the UN and say they're starving our people. This is collective punishment. This is a siege, that is, in our opinion, dirty politics or dirty diplomacy. Those outlets didn't exist. And that's why for a long time, countries would just send a bunch of troops or ships, just physically shut it down. We control the bay. So good luck getting a ship out. You know what I mean? And naval blockades were a huge part of the dominance of European empires in the age of expansion there. But as you fast forward, you see, like, through the centuries, sanctions have become more and more sophisticated. They become more and more surgically targeted. They've become more and more embedded in the world of international finance, but they are still a far cry from perfect, like a Far Cry 6 from perfect. In fact, a growing number of experts are convinced that sanctions don't actually work at all. So what does that mean? Why? This is a huge industry, by the way, sanctioning. Why did they come to that conclusion? We're going to pause for a word from our sponsors. Sanctions Are Us, and then we're going to dive into the answer.